Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Scott never imagined his life would change completely on an ordinary Tuesday in October. He was at home, sitting at the dining room table, organizing documents for a project he needed to review before the meeting the next morning. The afternoon was quiet, with that soft light coming through the window, and he was enjoying the silence to focus. At 38, Scott had built a solid career as a project engineer at a construction company, always meticulous, always responsible. His marriage to Hannah seemed just as stable. 11 years together, well-established routines, and trust he'd never questioned. His phone buzzed on the table. Scott glanced at it absent-mindedly and saw Hannah's name on the screen. He picked up the phone and read the message, "I'm working late tonight, urgent presentation for a client early tomorrow. Don't wait up for dinner." He typed a quick reply, something like, "Okay, good luck with the presentation," and turned his attention back to the papers in front of him. Hannah was a marketing manager at a large company, and last-minute presentations weren't unusual. He understood her pressure, always had. But then the phone buzzed again. Scott picked it up, expecting an emoji or a "thanks" from her. What he saw on the screen made time stop. The message said, "Same hotel, but it has to be quick, my husband's getting suspicious." He blinked, reread it, tried to process it. The words made no sense, certainly not coming to him. My husband's getting suspicious. She was talking about him. To someone else. Scott felt something strange in his chest, a pressure that grew as he read the message for the third, fourth time. It couldn't be. It had to be a mistake, some kind of mix-up. He stood up from his chair, walked to the window, came back, and looked at the screen again. The message was still there, real, undeniable. Hannah had sent it to him by accident. The phone slipped slightly in his sweaty hand. Scott took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but his mind was already racing. Same hotel. That meant it wasn't the first time. It meant routine, planning, repetition. And she thought he was getting suspicious? He hadn't suspected a thing until 5 minutes ago. Scott didn't reply to the messages. He stood in the middle of the living room, the silence in the house now oppressive. He needed to think, needed to understand. He couldn't just call Hannah and confront her based on a single message. Or could he? No, he needed more information. He needed to be sure. Anger was starting to boil beneath his attempt to rationalize everything. He walked back to the table, opened his laptop, and logged into their shared bank account. His eyes scanned the statements from the past few months. And then he started to see things. Charges from restaurants he didn't recognize. Small purchases at gift shops. Nothing alarming on its own, but now, in this new light, everything looked suspicious. Scott picked up his phone again and opened the car location app for Hannah's vehicle. They'd shared locations years ago, after she'd broken down on the highway and he'd been able to find her quickly. They'd never turned it off. He'd never had a reason to check it, until now. He pulled up the location history and felt his stomach sink. Over the past few weeks, her car had repeatedly gone to a specific address, a hotel about 15 minutes from her office. Not just once or twice. 6, 7, 8 times in the last month. Always on days she'd said she was working late. He closed the laptop harder than he'd intended. The house felt smaller, the air heavier. Scott walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and drank it all in one go. He needed concrete proof. He needed to know who. He needed to know how long. That night, when Hannah came home around 10:30, Scott was already in bed, pretending to sleep. She entered the room quietly, took a shower, and lay down beside him. He felt the mattress dip slightly under her weight, smelled the shampoo she always used. Everything so normal. So familiar. So false. The next morning, Scott left early for work without waking her. But instead of heading straight to the office, he stopped at a private investigation agency he'd seen advertised online. The waiting room was discreet, almost anonymous. A middle-aged man with gray hair and a professional demeanor greeted him. Scott explained the situation in a controlled voice, showing him the message, the GPS history, the bank statements. The investigator listened without interrupting, jotting notes in a pad. "How long will you need?" Scott asked, anxious for immediate answers. "A week, tops," the investigator replied, his voice calm and experienced. "I'll follow your wife discreetly, document the meetings, identify the other person involved. You'll get photos, videos, timestamps, everything recorded. But you'll need to act normal at home. You can't show any suspicion. If she realizes she's being watched, it'll be harder." Scott nodded. A week. 7 days of pretending everything was fine. 7 days sharing a bed with a lie. The days that followed were the longest of Scott's life. He'd wake up, have coffee with Hannah, chat about trivial things, the weather, the news, weekend plans. She kept up her usual routine, leaving for work, coming home late some nights, always with plausible excuses. Scott watched her every gesture, every word, searching for signs he'd missed before. The way she smiled at her phone when she thought he wasn't looking. The extra time she took in the shower. The slightly more elaborate outfits on certain days. On the third day, Hannah said during dinner, "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" Scott forced a smile. "Just tired. Work project's been tough." She accepted the explanation without pressing further. Or maybe she was relieved he wasn't asking more questions. Scott noticed she seemed distracted too, checking her phone often, texting with a half-smile on her lips. How had he not seen this before? On the 5th day, Scott almost gave up waiting. The agony of not knowing felt worse than any truth could be, or at least that's what he kept telling himself. But then, on the morning of the 7th day, the investigator called. "I've got what you need. Can we meet?" An hour later, Scott was back in the agency's discreet office. The investigator placed a thick envelope on the table. "I'm sorry for what you're about to see," he said, his voice genuinely compassionate. Scott opened the envelope. The first photos showed Hannah leaving her office, walking to her car. Then, her car parked outside the hotel Scott already recognized from the GPS data. The next photo made his world collapse, Hannah walking into the hotel lobby beside a man. Scott recognized the face immediately. Samuel. His cousin. His mother's sister's son. Samuel, who'd been at their wedding 11 years ago. Samuel, who showed up at family lunches. Samuel, who Scott considered a close friend. The photos kept coming. Samuel and Hannah entering the elevator. Later, walking out together, she adjusting her hair, he with his hand on her back. There were videos too. The investigator had recorded one of them talking in the hotel parking lot, laughing, kissing before getting into separate cars. The investigator's voice droned in the background, but Scott could barely hear him. He was staring at the photos, one after another, each image like a knife to the chest. "I've identified the man," the investigator said. Samuel Morrison, 42, works as a financial consultant. According to hotel records, they've met at least 8 times over the past 6 weeks. Always at the same time, always for 2 or 3 hours. Scott put the photos back in the envelope. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice stayed firm. "Thanks. How much do I owe you?" After settling the payment and leaving the agency, Scott sat in his car for a long while. He didn't cry. Didn't scream. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring into nothingness. Then, with strange clarity, he knew exactly what to do. That night, Scott had dinner with Hannah as if nothing had happened. She was cheerful, talking about a new project at work. He listened, asked the right questions, smiled at the right moments. When they went to bed, he waited for her to fall asleep and then grabbed his phone. He sent her a message: "I have to travel early tomorrow morning, to the construction site out of town. Urgent issue. Won't be back until the weekend." The next morning, Scott really did leave early, but he didn't go anywhere. He knew, from the pattern the investigator had documented, that Thursday was one of their usual meeting days. He waited, and right on schedule, around 2 p.m., he got a message from Hannah: "Gonna have to stay late tonight, important client meeting." Scott was ready. He drove to the hotel, parked discreetly, and waited. At 5:15 p.m., Hannah's car pulled into the lot. 3 minutes later, Samuel's car arrived. Scott watched as they met near the side entrance, shared a quick kiss, and walked in together. He waited 40 minutes, long enough for them to settle in, feel safe, and let their guard down. Scott entered the hotel with the envelope of photos in hand. He approached the front desk calmly. "My wife is staying here with someone else. I need the room number." The receptionist hesitated, but something in his expression must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation. She checked discreetly and murmured, "Room 312. Scott took the elevator up, each floor heightening his adrenaline. He reached room 312 and knocked, hard. 3 times. He heard movement inside, muffled whispers. Footsteps approaching. The door cracked open, and Samuel appeared, wearing only pants, his face turning pale as he recognized Scott. "Hey, cousin," Scott said, his voice icy. "I think we need to talk." He pushed past him into the room. Hannah sat on the bed, hurriedly pulling on a robe, her eyes wide with shock and panic. "Scott. Same hotel, but it has to be quick. My husband's getting suspicious." Scott recited the message that had changed everything, each word dripping with venom. "Remember that text, Hannah? The one you accidentally sent me a week ago?" The silence that followed was deafening. Hannah went pale. Samuel stepped back, raising his hands. "Dude, I can explain." "Can you?" Scott cut in, his calm more terrifying than any shout. "Are you going to explain how the cousin I considered a friend has been sleeping with my wife for months? Are you going to explain how you two laughed about it while I was at home, trusting you?" "Scott, please," Hannah started, tears streaming down her face. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. You didn't mean for it to happen?" Scott laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You just didn't mean to get caught. But turns out, I was smarter than you thought." He tossed the envelope onto the bed. The photos spilled out, revealing every meeting, every documented lie. Hannah looked at them and sobbed, covering her face. Samuel stood frozen, colorless. "A private investigator is a wonderful tool," Scott went on. "I've got photos, videos, dates, times. I've got it all. And you know what's funniest? You picked the same damn hotel. The same room, sometimes. So much originality." "I'm sorry," Hannah cried. "I swear I am, it was weakness, Save the performance," Scott interrupted. "I don't want your excuses. I want you to know I've already spoken to my lawyer. The divorce proceedings start Monday. And I want you to know I've sent copies of all this to my mom, to your mom, Samuel, to the whole family. So everyone knows what kind of person you are. What kind of people you both are." Samuel finally found his voice. "Scott, she came on to me. I was vulnerable, Scott turned to him with pure contempt in his eyes. "Don't go blaming her alone now. You both made choices. Every time you met here, every time you lied, every time you laughed behind my back, choices." Hannah stood up from the bed, trying to approach him. "Scott, please, we can talk about this, we can try." "We've got nothing to talk about," he said, stepping back. You destroyed 11 years in cheap hotel rooms. You destroyed our family. And Samuel, you destroyed yours too, because I guarantee your mom already knows. I called her before coming here. Samuel's face drained of even more color. He staggered slightly, leaning against the wall. Scott looked at them both one last time, Hannah crying on the bed, Samuel slumped against the wall as if the world had collapsed. And maybe it had. You deserve each other, he said, turning toward the door. Enjoy it. He left the room, took the elevator down, walked through the lobby. A few people glanced his way, maybe sensing the tension, but Scott didn't care. He got in his car and, finally alone, allowed himself to feel it. But it wasn't tears. It was anger. Relief. Certainty that he'd done the right thing. In the weeks that followed, Scott's life turned upside down, but he kept control. His lawyer was efficient. Hannah tried to contest the divorce, tried to claim part of the house and investments, but the evidence was undeniable. Documented adultery, with the spouse's own cousin, constituted a total breach of trust. The judge was clear, divorce granted, assets divided in Scott's favor. Hannah lost more than just the marriage. At her job, word got around. Some co-workers who'd known about the affair and never said anything started avoiding her. Others openly judged her. Her reputation was ruined. She called Scott many times in the first few weeks, sending long messages begging for forgiveness, for a chance to explain, to start over. He blocked her number. Samuel faced even worse consequences. His family, especially his mother, was devastated. He was excluded from family gatherings, birthdays, holidays. The weight of betraying family was unbearable for everyone. Even his own sister stopped speaking to him. Samuel tried to justify himself, saying it just happened, that they never meant to hurt anyone, but no one wanted to hear it. Scott, on the other hand, found unexpected support. True friends showed up, offering emotional backup. His mother, though heartbroken by her nephew's betrayal, stood firmly by her son. She'd say, eyes glistening, "You deserve someone who values you." Hannah never did. 6 months after the confrontation at the hotel, Scott was different, not fully healed, but stronger. He sold the house he'd shared with Hannah and bought a smaller, more modern apartment in a neighborhood he'd always wanted to live in. He started going to the gym, picked up old hobbies he'd abandoned. He went out with friends, traveled alone for the first time in years. He discovered that enjoying his own company was liberating. A year after the message that changed everything, Scott was at a cafe near work when he saw Hannah. She was sitting alone in a corner booth, scrolling through her phone, looking tired. Her hair was shorter, she seemed thinner, and her eyes held a sadness Scott had never seen before. Hannah looked up, saw him, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. She raised her hand timidly, as if to call him over. Scott looked at her for one more second, then simply turned and walked out of the cafe. Not with anger. Not with pain. Just indifference. He realized Hannah no longer had any power over him. She was just someone he'd once known, in another life. As he walked down the street under the afternoon sun, Scott felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Not the peace of someone who'd forgotten or easily forgiven, but the peace of someone who'd moved on and built something new. The betrayal had nearly destroyed him, but in the end, it revealed a freeing truth. He was stronger than he'd ever imagined. And he deserved more than crumbs of loyalty. Life went on, and now, for the first time in a long while, Scott was excited to see what came next. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.